Hello everyone! In this video we're going to go over alcohol reactions. So in our previous chapter we talked about alkenes and how we can add water across a double bond to create an alcohol. Well, we can also do the opposite reaction. So we can start with an alcohol, remove a water molecule, and create an alkene. So this would be called dehydration because we're removing water from our molecule. Now this specific reaction occurs at 180 degrees Celsius, and in addition to calling this a dehydration reaction, we can also call it an elimination reaction. So we're going to start with our alcohol, and we're going to add sulfuric acid, kind of as almost a catalyst that helps the reaction along. We're going to heat the reaction to 180 degrees Celsius, and that's going to remove a hydrogen from one carbon and an OH group from the next carbon over, so neighboring carbons, and we're going to end up with a water molecule, but additionally, if we draw our electrons here, the red electrons are going to team up together and form our double bond, and then the blue electrons are going to team up together and reform that bond between the hydrogen and the OH group to create water. So then at the very end, we get an alkene. So looking at a specific example, let's say we have the molecule 2-propanol. So that means we have an OH group on the second carbon in the chain. So again, we're going to add sulfuric acid and heat the reaction to 180 degrees Celsius, and we're going to see a water molecule form, and we're also going to see our double bond form. So we end up with the molecule propene. Now in this example, the alcohol was symmetrical. So you could have also taken a hydrogen from the carbon on the left and you would have ended up with the same product. But what happens if you have an asymmetrical molecule? So for instance, let's say we have 2-butanol. So if we look at the carbon that the alcohol is bonded to, we have an ethyl group on one side and a methyl group on the other. So this is asymmetrical. So now if we perform a dehydration reaction, the question is, what side are we going to take a hydrogen from? So we could take a hydrogen from either side and end up with two products. So we could take a hydrogen from the left or from the right, and that's going to give us either a double bond in the middle of the molecule or a double bond on the end of the molecule. And of course, we have our water molecule as one of our products as well. So we get 2-butene and 1-butene as our products. However, when we run this type of experiment, what we find is that only 10% of our mixture of products is 1-butene. So why would we only form 10% of 1-butene, but 90% of 2-butene? Well, it has to do with the stability of the double bond. So double bonds that have more carbon groups attached are more stable. So if we look at 2-butene and kind of draw out all of the different bonds, let's see, we have a hydrogen and a methyl group on one side. So we're focusing on that carbon on the left. On the right-hand side, we have a hydrogen and a methyl group as well. So there's two carbon groups bonded to the double bond. But let's look at 1-butene and compare. So if we draw out 1-butene, on, let's see, the left-hand side, we have a hydrogen and an ethyl group. On the other side, we have two hydrogens. So there's really only one carbon group bonded to the double bond, which makes it less stable. So if your double bond can go in the middle of the molecule, that's going to be more stable, and therefore that product is going to form more often than the less stable product. So that's why 2-butene is our principal or predominant product. So just something to keep in mind if you're going through these types of reactions. Now let's look at a biological example of a dehydration reaction. So in our cells, we're constantly producing energy. And we produce energy through what's called the citric acid cycle. Now, the citric acid cycle has a lot of different steps in it, but one of the steps is converting what's called citrate to cis-aconitate. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Some of these names are hard to pronounce. But what happens in this step is we start with an alcohol, so citrate, and then we add an enzyme that helps to dehydrate our citrate molecule. So then we end up forming our water molecule and a double bond. Now again, this is just one step of the citric acid cycle, but this is a really important step because this is part of cellular respiration, and eventually that leads to the production of energy. Now let's look at another reaction. So we just saw that we can form a double bond from an alcohol, but under slightly different conditions, we can perform a dehydration reaction that produces an ether instead of an alkene. So if we heat to 140 degrees Celsius and we have two alcohol molecules, they're actually going to combine together to create a water molecule and an ether. So let's look down below. Okay, so we have one alcohol on the left and one alcohol on the right. And remember that R is just any alkyl group. So that could be a methyl group, an ethyl group, a propyl group, whatever it might be. Now what's going to happen here is similar to before. We're going to add our catalyst, sulfuric acid. But this time we're only going to heat to 140 degrees Celsius. And then the OH group from one alcohol and then a hydrogen from the other alcohol are going to team up together to create a water molecule. And then the other components, so the alkyl group from our first alcohol and then the OR group from the second alcohol are going to team up and create our ether. And remember, an ether has an oxygen atom between two alkyl groups. And those alkyl groups could be the same or different. So looking down below, we have a more specific example. So we've got an ethanol molecule on the left and an ethanol molecule on the right. And again, the OH group from one of the alcohols will team up with the hydrogen from our other ethanol, and that's going to create water. And then the ethyl group from our first ethanol molecule, and then this OCH2CH3, which we'll just call ethoxy group from the other ethanol, they're going to team up and create our ether. So this ether in particular is called diethyl ether because we have an ethyl group on the left, an ethyl group on the right, so that's our diethyl. And then this is an ether, so we just end the name with ether. But we'll talk about how to name ethers later on, so don't worry about naming just yet. All right, let's go to our third alcohol reaction called oxidation. So in this reaction, oxidation involves the removal of hydrogen atoms. You can also think of this as the addition of a carbon-oxygen bond. So we're going to start with an alcohol, of course, since these are alcohol reactions. And then we're going to add something called an oxidizing agent. And we can abbreviate that as O in parentheses. But essentially what happens here is we're going to take a hydrogen from our alcohol group, so from the oxygen, and then we're also going to take a hydrogen from the carbon that the oxygen is bonded to. So these are kind of neighboring hydrogens, if you will. Then those are going to bond with the oxygen from our oxidizing agent. So those three atoms are going to make up our water molecule, H2O. So what's really happening here, let's just kind of draw some electrons. And we'll draw a couple of electrons on oxygen as well. And then we'll draw some electrons that will create our double bond. Okay. So the oxygen is going to form a bond with the hydrogen from the oxygen on our alcohol, and then it will also form a new bond with the hydrogen from the carbon that our alcohol is bonded to. So then at the end, that will give us our water molecule. And then the other electrons that are left over are going to team up and create our double bond. All right, so that gives us a carbon double bonded to oxygen. So depending on what's bonded here and here on our original alcohol, we could end up with either an aldehyde or a ketone. And we'll look at some specific examples in a second. So you might be wondering, okay, what are oxidizing agents and what are we actually using? So typically oxidizing agents are either K2CR2O7 or KMNO4. So these are molecules that contain a lot of oxygen atoms. So they're perfect for oxidation reactions. So the first molecule is called potassium dichromate, and the second molecule is called potassium permanganate. So either one is fine to use here. Now remember in the last lecture I told you that it was really important to be able to tell whether an alcohol is primary, secondary, or tertiary. Well, that's because in oxidation reactions, they produce completely different products. So if you have a primary alcohol and you oxidize it, that's going to first produce an aldehyde as an intermediate. But if you're using a really strong oxidizing agent like potassium dichromate or potassium permanganate, then that's just going to further oxidize into a carboxylic acid. If you have a secondary alcohol, you're going to end up producing a ketone. If you have a tertiary alcohol, there's actually no reaction. And part of the reason that we don't have a reaction there is a tertiary alcohol won't have this hydrogen here that we used up above. That would be replaced by a carbon group. But that hydrogen is really important for these types of reactions. So let's look at some specific examples. So let's look at a primary alcohol oxidation. Okay, so again, we have our oxidizing agent, so either potassium dichromate or potassium permanganate. And that again is going to team up with the hydrogen from our alcohol group and one of the hydrogens on the neighboring carbon. So what will be left over after we form our water molecule is an aldehyde, because we have an alkyl group bonded to a carbon, which has a double bond to oxygen, and then there's a hydrogen on the other side of carbon. So that gives us our aldehyde functional group. But remember I said that we typically don't see this intermediate. We actually keep oxidizing, and we're going to add another oxygen right next to that hydrogen on carbon. So we end up forming an OH group there. So now the aldehyde has become a carboxylic acid. All right, now if you have a secondary alcohol, similar process. The oxygen from our oxidizing agent will team up with those two hydrogens, and we form our water molecule. But this time, what's left over are two alkyl groups that are bonded to our carbon that has a double bond to oxygen. So this would be called a ketone because we have two alkyl groups surrounding that middle carbon there. All right, and now what if we have a tertiary alcohol? So again, remember that typically we're going to use our oxygen from our oxidizing agent, and it's going to team up with the hydrogen from our alcohol group, and we don't have any other hydrogens on that carbon, right? So we can't perform this reaction because we're supposed to form a water molecule. Now, again, also remember that the electrons that are left over here and here form a double bond, right? So one of those red electrons came from the hydrogen that was attached to carbon, so from that bond. But here, because we don't have a hydrogen connected to that carbon, we don't have an electron available to create a double bond. So there's just no reaction here for tertiary alcohols. And again, this is why it's important to be able to classify alcohols as primary, secondary, or tertiary. Now, a specific example of this type of oxidation, let's say we start with ethanol. So we have two carbons bonded to our OH group there, or a two carbon group, I should say. And again, we're going to oxidize that. So we're going to see our oxidizing agent team up with our hydrogen from the alcohol group and one of the hydrogens from the carbon that's bonded to it. And we're going to form our water molecule. And initially what we form is something called acid aldehyde. But then after further oxidation, we're going to insert an oxygen in between carbon and hydrogen, and we end up with, oops, carboxylic acid called acetic acid. And this is actually a process that occurs in our bodies when we're kind of breaking down ethanol. And down below, there's actually a test that you can do to see if you do have a primary alcohol. So in the first picture on the left, we have our oxidizing agent, potassium dichromate, in the first test tube, and it's orange. And then we have ethanol in the right test tube, and that is colorless. Now, once we add the oxidizing agent to ethanol, so we're just going to pour that into our other test tube there, the ethanol is oxidized and the chromium atom from potassium dichromate is reduced. So it gains hydrogen atoms, or rather loses oxygen atoms. And we're going to form this kind of grayish green solid. So this is one test you can do to kind of see what type of alcohol you have. Okay, now let's summarize everything we learned so far with alcohol reactions, because there are a lot. And I will post flashcards for you so you can go through those and kind of memorize them, and then you can go back and try to kind of understand each of the reactions. At least that's what I would do if I was studying these reactions. So again, we're starting with an alcohol for each of these reactions. Now, if we add sulfuric acid, H2SO4, that's going to give us a dehydration reaction. But depending on the temperature, we could end up with different products. So remember, if you heat your solution to 180 degrees Celsius, you get an alkene. But if you heat your reaction to 140 degrees Celsius, you get an ether. So let's just write the generic forms here. There we go. Okay, now what if you oxidize with either potassium dichromate or potassium permanganate? So if you use either of those oxidizing agents on your alcohol, you're performing oxidation. However, depending on the type of alcohol you have, you could get different products. So if your alcohol is a primary alcohol, you'll get an intermediate aldehyde, but unfortunately we can't really isolate it. It's actually going to further oxidize into a carboxylic acid. So that will be our ultimate product there. If you have a secondary alcohol, that will form a ketone. And if you have a tertiary alcohol, there is no reaction. So let's just write the generic form of a carboxylic acid. And we'll also write the generic form for a ketone. Okay, now let's just do some practice to see if we can remember how each of these reactions work. So I'll give you 3 reactions, and I want you to try to figure out the products. All right, so let's draw our first reaction. Okay, see if you can figure out the product for that one. I'm also going to draw a second reaction. And our final reaction. All right, so you can pause the video, try these on your own first, and when you're done, you can unpause and we'll go over them together. Okay, let's look at the first problem. So in this problem, we have our alcohol, and then we're adding sulfuric acid at 180 degrees Celsius. Okay, so if we look back at our flow chart, we're going to the left, so we're performing a dehydration reaction. And the temperature was 180 degrees Celsius, so that tells me I should end up with an alkene. Now, we have to figure out where that double bond is going to be. Okay, so we know that in a dehydration reaction, we're losing a water molecule. So that tells me we're probably going to lose this OH group, and let's see, a hydrogen from a neighboring carbon. So the OH group is attached directly to this carbon, so we're going to lose a hydrogen from the next carbon over, so the neighboring carbon. So that tells me the double bond is probably going to be between these two carbons here. Okay, so let's just draw, let's see, so this carbon's losing a hydrogen. Okay, so it will just be CH. We're going to form a double bond with the carbon next to it. Okay, perfect. And the carbon on the very end isn't losing any hydrogens because it's just losing that OH group. So it still keeps all its hydrogens. All right. And then you can also write plus H2O to indicate that we formed a water molecule. Let's look at the second reaction. Okay, this one is, let's see, we've got two alcohols and we've added sulfuric acid at 140 degrees Celsius. So let's go back to our chart. And if we're adding sulfuric acid, that means we're going to the left. We're performing a dehydration reaction, and the temperature was at 140 degrees Celsius. So that means we're forming an ether. Okay, so we have to figure out what our ether will look like, but similar to the reaction above, we're still going to lose a water molecule. So let's say we lose the OH group from one alcohol, and then the hydrogen from the next alcohol. Okay, so that is our H2O molecule, and then we just have to kind of piece together what's left. And it doesn't really matter which alcohol you take the OH from and which one you take the hydrogen from. You'll still get the same product, so it's okay if you did it slightly differently than I did. Okay, so our product, it looks like, should be CH3O, and then we're going to add this ethyl group, so CH2CH3. Okay, perfect. All right, let's look at our last example. So this one, again, we have our alcohol, and this time we're adding one of those oxidizing agents, potassium dichromate. So it doesn't really matter, again, which oxidizing agent we use. The main idea is that we're going to create a water molecule using one of the oxygens, the hydrogen from our alcohol group, and then a hydrogen from the neighboring carbon there. Okay, so that will create H2O. But now we have to figure out what's left over and what we would form. So let's classify this alcohol. Is this alcohol primary, secondary, or tertiary? Secondary. So if we look at the carbon that's bonded to the OH group, we want to figure out how many carbons is that bonded to. And it's bonded to 1, 2. So that means it is a Oops, I wrote a 2 instead of secondary. So that is a secondary alcohol. So if we go back to our chart, secondary alcohols will produce a ketone. Okay, so what we would have left over is CH3C, and then remember that middle carbon lost a hydrogen, but it gained a second bond to oxygen, and then we have CH3 on the other side. So that's our ketone. Okay, so again, in the first reaction, we formed an alkene. The second reaction, we formed an ether. And in the third reaction, we formed a ketone.